Hello health lovers, so it's your student Nurse V, and today on health episode I'm going to be continuing from where I stopped. So in my last video I introduced the nervous system and I talked about the neurulation, citing 8 stages of neurulation. So in today's video I'm simply going to be talking about the organization of the nervous system. Now the organization of the nervous system is the divisions of the nervous system. Now the nervous system is divided into two. We have the central nervous system and we have the peripheral nervous system. So now we are going to be talking about the central nervous system because it is very broad. Now this central nervous system coordinates the activities of the body, and it does this with using 3 functions. Now how does it do this? It receives sensory nerve information. Now once it receives the sensory nerve information, it processes this information, and when it processes it, it interprets what it got, and once it interprets it, it now sends out. That's it responds using a motor output. So that's basically the definition of central nervous system, and you'll see we have also talked about some of the functions. So what is the central nervous system? It coordinates this body by receiving sensory information, processing it, and responding with motor output. Now let me cite an example. Someone pinch you. Now that pinch sends a signal. That's the sensory. Remember, we have like sense organ, your what you feel, what you see. Now that pinch, you felt a pinch, right? Now that pinch sends a signal to your brain. Now your brain is the central nervous system, it's part of the central nervous system. Now what does the brain do? We say it interprets. So it interprets that, oh, this is a pinch, and once it interprets, it responds using motor output. Now that reaction that you give to that pinch, that pain that you feel, that sudden, like you suddenly removing your hand, that action that you do, maybe pushing the person away, that is the motor output. Now that is what the central nervous system do. It receives the stimulus. When it receives the stimulus, it interprets the stimulus and then tells the body how to react to the stimulus. That is when you know that the weather is hot, the weather is cold. This place is this is fire, it will burn me. Why? Because that burn goes to the brain now interprets it and now makes you feel the heat, and you now start doing like this. So that is that. So if you talk about the functions of the central nervous system, it has 3 basic functions. Now, number 1, it receives information from the sensory nerves. Number 2, it processes the information received from the sensory nerves. Now, number 3, it responds to this information using motor output. Now, we are done with that. Now, we want to talk about the divisions of the central nervous system. Now, the central nervous system is divided into 2. Now, we have the brain and we have the spinal cord. Now let's talk about the brain, because the brain is a very vital organ. So the brain is a highly specialized organ of the central nervous system that is situated in the cranial cavity. Now the cranial cavity, that's simply the skull. So the brain is a very specialized, because that is the most important organ in the central nervous system. That is the brain, because without the brain the spinal cord will not work or will not function properly. So the brain is a highly specialized organ of the central nervous system situated in the cranial cavity. So the length of the brain is about 15 to 17 cm. The shape of the brain is roughly oval. Then we talk about the color of the brain. The color of the brain is grayish white, kind of, because it's composed of both gray and white matter. The weight of the brain is about 1.2 to 1.4 kg. Now the structures that protect the brain, we have the cranium. Now the cranium is the skull. So the skull helps to protect the brain. Now the next thing that protects the brain is the meninges. Now the meninges surrounds the brain and helps to protect the brain, and also the cerebrospinal fluid. So these are the 3 things that protect the brain. So we have the cranium, then we have the meninges, and we have the cerebrospinal fluid. Now let's talk about the composition of the brain. Now the brain is composed of 60% fat. That is why if you are the person that always like eating this ishewu, like goat head, you will see even normal this thing, animal brain, you will see it's always fatty. So it has more of fat. That is how our brain is. So it's composed of 60% fat. So the remaining 40% has to do with water, protein, carbohydrate, and salt. So those makes up the remaining 40%. So that's the composition of the brain. Now moving forward, let's talk about the function of the brain. Why do we have brain? Is our brain necessary? Now come closer. Let me tell you about the functions of the brain. Number 1, the brain helps to coordinate body activities. If your brain is not working, you will start to kolo. You will start to behave psychotic, you get. So the brain helps to coordinate body activities. Another function of the brain is that the brain helps to regulate emotions. Yes, there are some people that know how to control their emotions. Everything comes from where? The brain. Now the brain helps to maintain consciousness. Now if someone is fully conscious, you know there are some stages or levels of consciousness. We have the alert, the obtunded, the comatose, and the legatic. So it depends on your brain. If your brain is very, very active, you can now say you are alert. If your brain is, let's say you're kind of drowsy, it's from your brain, you can be obtunded. So there are different levels of consciousness, and all these levels of consciousness is controlled by the brain. Another thing is that the brain helps in logical reasoning. You don't think from your hand, you don't think from your ear, you think from where? Your brain. So your brain helps in what? Logical reasoning. Now the brain also helps to regulate heartbeat. Yes, the brain helps in regulating what? Heartbeat. Another function of the brain is that the brain controls endocrine activities. Now particularly, that is when you're talking about the hypothalamus. Now the hypothalamus plays a role. We have the pituitary gland and the rest. So it plays a major role in endocrine activities, and these endocrine activities, it has to do with hormones. So the brain plays a role in that. Now the brain helps in breathing. Do you know that there's a part of the brain that is responsible for breathing, and that is what? The medulla oblongata, that is located behind, that is the brain stem. So it is responsible for what? Breathing. Now the last function of the brain has numerous functions, but for the sake of this video, the last function of the brain is that the brain helps to maintain balance. For you to be able to sit down and coordinate, walk like a normal human being, that means your brain is active. Now, there's a part of the brain that is called the cerebellum, and the cerebellum helps to maintain balance and posture. The ability for you to sit down like a normal human being, get up and walk without shaking, doing like epileptic and the rest, that means your cerebellum is active, you get. So that is one of the functions of the brain. So you are done talking about the function of the brain. So let's quickly dive into divisions of the brain. Now the brain is divided into three. If you watch my previous video when I was talking about neurulation, I talked about differentiation of the brain. So the brain is divided into three parts. Now we have the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. Now the forebrain is called the prosencephalon. The forebrain is called the prosencephalon, the midbrain is called the mesencephalon, and the hindbrain is the rhobencephalon. So that is the three divisions of the brain. We have the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. Now let's talk about the forebrain. Now the forebrain is the largest and the most developed part of the brain. That big part that we all know, that is the forebrain. It is the largest and is the most developed part of the brain, and it is situated in what? The cranium. So this core mainly houses the forebrain. The rest makes up the brain stem down. So it mainly is located in the cranium. What are the structures in the forebrain? Now we have the cerebrum, we have the thalamus, and we have the hypothalamus. Now let's briefly talk about the anatomy of the cerebrum. Now the cerebrum is the largest and the most developed part of the brain that is situated in the cranium. And we move forward to talk about the divisions of the cerebrum. Now the cerebrum, if you look at the brain very well, you can see it's divided into two. Now the cerebrum is divided into two lateral hemispheres by a deep groove, that long line that divides it into left and right. That long line is a deep groove, and that groove is called the longitudinal feature. So the cerebrum is divided into two lateral hemispheres by a deep groove called the longitudinal feature. Now we have the left cerebral hemisphere and we have the right cerebral hemisphere. Now let's talk about the functional lateralization, that is the functions of this hemisphere. Now in the left cerebral hemisphere is responsible for logical reasoning, analytical thinking, mathematical this thing. So if you're a kind of person that you know how to solve maths, you know how to think fast, very logical, critical thinker, you're extra intelligent, all those things, you know that you are really thinking from the left side of your brain. Now let's talk about the right hemisphere. Now the right hemisphere is responsible for creativity. What other thing? We have the art interpretation, facial recognition. If you're someone that you are very creative, if you have a house, you know the way you arrange your house, so creative, you always bring out creative ideas for innovation. If you're someone that you're very creative, just know that you think more from the right side of the brain. Now you may want to ask, how is it possible to think left side How is it possible to think right side? Now take note that both cerebral hemisphere, they work together, they communicate with each other by a small structure. Now there's a structure in between that groove. There's a little structure there that communicates. Whatever you reason here, it sends it to this one and you coordinate. Now that small structure that is there is called the corpus callosum. Now this corpus callosum helps to transmit the information from the left to the right so that you'll be able to act normal. Now you may ask, what if I'm not able, maybe what if I cannot think fast? What if I'm not good in creativity? Now, one part of the hemisphere is always more dominant. Now, ask yourself, am I someone that is very logical? Can I calculate? Can I think fast, critically? Just know that you dominate more of the left cerebral hemisphere. Then if you ask yourself, am I someone that if I go and learn a skill, I'm very creative, I know how to sew, I know how to do things that is innovative, you think more from the right side of the right hemisphere of the brain. Now, if there is a problem with that connection, that corpus callosum, it can lead to what they call the split brain syndrome. That's when they say someone you're left brain dead, or they will tell someone you're right brain dead. That's to say you don't even know how to, let's say your left brain, your left cerebral hemisphere is not communicating with your right. That's to say your left side, you don't even know how to think fast, you don't know how to reason fast and the rest, but you're more creative. So you just possess one part of the brain. Either you're possessing the left or you're possessing the right. So that is the functional lateralization of the brain. So moving forward, let's talk about the tissues found in the cerebral hemispheres. Now, there are two types of tissues that is found in these two cerebral hemispheres. Now we have the gray matter and we have the white matter. Now let's talk about the gray matter. Now the gray matter is otherwise known as the cerebral cortex, and it is the outer layer of the cerebrum. Now it's composed of neuron cell bodies. It's also composed of dendrites. Then it also has the synapse. Now when we talk about the white matter, now the white matter makes the inner layer, is the inner part of the cerebrum. So the white matter is the inner part of the cerebrum. Now it's composed of axons. You know the axon is composed of axon and it's also composed of myelin. Now, moving forward, we are going to talk about the lobes of the cerebrum. Remember, we are still on the anatomy of the cerebrum. Now, the cerebrum, that's each of the cerebral hemisphere, is divided into 4 lobes, and these lobes have different functions. Now, take note of the function. We have the frontal lobe, we have the parietal lobe, we have the temporal lobe, and we have the occipital lobe. Those are the 4 lobes of the brain. 4 lobes of the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the main part of the brain. So when you hear me say brain, just know I'm talking about the cerebrum. So we have the frontal lobe, the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, and the temporal lobe. Now let's talk about the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is separated by the parietal lobe by a central sulcus. Take note, the frontal lobe is separated from the temporal lobe by a lateral sulcus. When we talk about sulcus, we are going to explain what sulcus is. So take note, the frontal lobe is separated from the parietal lobe by a central sulcus. Is separated from the temporal lobe by a lateral sulcus. Now, what is the frontal lobe responsible for? Now, the frontal lobe is responsible for reasoning, planning, logical thinking. When you're thinking, that's why if you notice, most time whenever you are writing an exams or you're thinking too much, you're thinking, where will I get food, what will I do for this, I'm looking for money. At some point you feel a headache around here. You're stressing the frontal lobe of your brain. It begins to ache because you're stressing, you're overstraining it. So all those thinking, like you're thinking too much, it comes from here, the frontal lobe. Now let's talk about the next one. Next one is the parietal lobe. Now the parietal lobe is separated from the frontal lobe by what? The central sulcus. Remember what we said. Is separated from the frontal lobe by what? The central sulcus. And the parietal lobe is responsible for touch. If someone touch you, the part of your brain that feels that touch and is telling you that something has touched you is from your parietal lobe. Temperature, the part of your brain that will tell you that this house is hot, is from where? Your parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is also responsible for pressure. If something presses you, that part of your brain that will tell you that something is pressing you, shift from this place, so before it breaks your bone, that is from the parietal lobe. It's also responsible for pain. Someone bites you, something pinch you, or fire or something. That thing that makes you feel that pain is coming from where? Your parietal lobe. Now we go over to the next one, which is the temporal lobe. Now the temporal lobe is separated from the frontal lobe using what? The lateral fissure, or you call it the lateral sulcus. Now, primarily, the temporal lobe is responsible for memories, emotions, hearing. So that part of your brain that helps you to, this is where the temporal lobe is here and here. So that part of your brain that helps you to hear things, that part of your brain that helps you to keep memories. Oh, those things you will sit down, oh, I had a lovely moment this time last year. That part of your brain that helps you to have emotions, like you feel emotional or something, is coming from where? The temporal lobe. The temporal lobe has what they call the auditory cortex. Now, this auditory cortex receives information from the ear, and once it receives the information from the ear, it processes the information so that we understand what we are hearing. Now, the medial part of the temporal lobe has what they call hippocampus. Now, the hippocampus is responsible for keeping memories, learning, and also emotions. So take note of the auditory cortex and the hippocampus. So now let's talk about the last lobe of the cerebrum. Now, the last lobe of the cerebrum is the occipital lobe. Now, this occipital lobe is separated from the parietal lobe by the parieto-occipital sulcus. So take note, when I'm talking about sulcus, I will explain what it's all about. So now, it is the major visual processing center in the brain. When I say visual processing center, it means that it interprets visual image. Let's say, for instance, you see something. That part of your brain that says this thing you're seeing is a cup is coming from where? The occipital lobe. It lies behind the parietal lobe. It is separated from the parietal lobe by the parieto-occipital sulcus. Is the major visual processing center of the brain. It interprets those visual image, those things that you use your eyes to see. Now, let's talk about the sulcus and features in the brain, that's in the cerebrum. Now, we have different sulcus and features in the cerebrum. Now, we have the central sulcus, like I said earlier. It differentiates, it separates the parietal from the frontal lobe. We have the lateral sulcus. It separates the temporal from the frontal lobe. Then we have the parieto-occipital sulcus. Now, it separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. Then lastly, we have the longitudinal feature. Now, the longitudinal feature is what divides the cerebrum into the left and right hemisphere. Now, what is this sulcus? How will you determine a sulcus? Now, if you look at a brain, you see the brain looks like it's folding, right? Now, the part of the brain that folds inside is called a sulcus, or you call it a sulci. Now, the part of the brain that is out, like it's coming out as if you want to fold inside, that part that bulge out is called a gyrus. Now, when it bulge out is a gyrus, it folds in is a sulcus. Do well to take note of that. Now, lastly, let's talk about the blood supply to the cerebrum. Arterial blood supply. How does the cerebrum get their oxygenated blood? Now, they get their oxygenated blood from the circles of Wills, or you just say the cerebral arteries, particularly the circles of Wills. Now, venous drainage, it can be drained through the dura sinuses in the brain, or it can also be drained through the cerebral veins. And that is all about the anatomy of the cerebrum. So take note of everything being said. I talked about the cerebrum, the divisions of the cerebrum, the functional lateralization of the cerebrum, the lobes of the cerebrum, the sulci, the features, and also the blood supply. So do well to like, share, and follow. In our next video, we are going to be talking about the anatomy of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And do well to share my video to your friends. Thank you very much. I hope you all learned. Bye.